My guest today is Dr. Jo Lukito of the University of Texas, Austin. She's also serving on our new election science task force here at the Union of Concerned Scientists, which is working to strengthen the science behind evaluating and advancing free and fair elections. Jo directs the Media and Democracy Data Cooperative, and she's an expert in computational sociolinguistics. Her work caught my attention because it's tailor made for understanding democracy in the age of alternative facts. In a time when politicians underscore that they will not compromise with the opposing party, and when the informal rules of political decorum have been trampled into something that would be absolutely unrecognizable to the politicians of yesteryear, we desperately need hard data and facts to help educate the public, scientists, and politicians on the language that is currently rocking the foundations of our democracy. Jo, I appreciate you being here with me. Would you start us off by explaining how you've blended programming with analyzing political language?
Absolutely. And thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to be on your podcast. I as a child, I think I've always been really interested in politics. I remember when I was in elementary school and they were covering the Bush Al Gore election, and I was just fascinated in the media coverage of it, how it was discussed, how my parents were voting. And so I've always had this interest in politics, but specifically how we talk about politics. How do citizens make sense of political issues? And how do politicians try to persuade us to vote for them? And so when I decided to go to graduate school, I knew this was going to be a real central focus of mine. And I was growing up very much in the internet age. And it was a time when a lot of politicians and a lot of citizens were starting to talk about politics online on social media platforms. And as I started doing this work, I realized I would not be able to do it all by hand. I needed to find a way to scale it up. And so I started looking into computational methods and programming languages to see if there was a way that I could use these new tools to study large and large amounts of social media data, of news data, and of political text. And it ended up becoming a really useful way to not just look at individual messages, but to look at millions of messages, to understand these kind of patterns of communication and the kind of narratives. And especially now, because of the number of platforms that we have on the internet and because of how prominent the internet has become in all of our day to day lives, this kind of work, I think, has just become even more important, right?
Yeah, that is like a great origin story, I would say, because it's not only is it's cool and it's interesting that you immediately thought, how do I scale up? But it's also so timely.
Totally.
I mean, that sounds like your childhood and your formative years were just in this explosion of information and information accessibility that it makes sense that you'd be like, oh, I want to follow this where it leads.
Yeah. And I think for a lot of, scientists, they do the research that they do because there was some origin story, something that happened, right, that motivated them to ask questions. And for me, that happened to be related to political language. And especially as someone who, is a first generation academic and a first generation researcher, but a first generation American as well. I think it just became really important for me to understand how to communicate and talk about politics, and especially in the age of alternative facts, as you've mentioned, and the rise of relying on digital platforms for information, some of which is good and some of which is bad. We really do desperately need these computational tools to help us sift and winnow things, because the reality is we can't have, like, no individual person, researcher or otherwise, can look at 10 million tweets, right? And this is really what a computer is actually capable of doing.
Yeah, I don't think it would be healthy for anyone, with a pulse
Nope.
to look at that many tweets.
Yeah.
So all right, so then what does data about how specific language spreads across different platforms, what does that allow policymakers to do to protect free and fair elections?
Yeah. So, I kind of, as you alluded, our media ecology now consists of tons of platforms. When I started my time on the internet, we maybe had like 6 or 7 different social media platforms. I remember when MySpace was a thing and Facebook was all the rage. And now we have over 20 really popular platforms in various forms, right? And we have platforms, some of which are more video based like YouTube and TikTok, and we have platforms that are still more text based, right? The platform formerly known as Twitter, now X. And of course, plenty of other social media platforms have imitated that sort of structure. And what we're finding now is that not only are these platforms using different modal forms of communication, like some video, some image, some text, but we're also finding that these platforms have different types of communication strategies, right, based on different audiences. And so I've become especially concerned with when there is harmful online content, whether in the form of misinformation or calls for violence or hate speech. How does it kind of manifest on one platform? And at what point is there a spillover onto another platform? I
Huh.
do get really worried when we do a lot of research on just the mainstream platforms that we miss out on potentially harmful communication and conversation. So, to use a really concrete example, a lot of the organizing that happened prior to the insurrection on January 6th was not necessarily happening on mainstream platforms. They were happening on these alternative tech or these smaller platforms like Telegram and Parler. And if we don't pay attention to it, they're really dire and serious offline consequences.
Right. And just this morning, I heard that basically Trump's Truth Social is going to be taken public via merger. And I know that's going to
Yeah.
change the landscape even more. So that's a perfect segue. I wanted
Yeah.
you to talk to me about dis and misinformation because there is a difference between the two. And I think it would be really helpful for our audience to know what that distinction is.
Totally. So when I talk about dis and misinformation, the one thing that is similar about both of them is that they both relate to false information. It's content that we can determine is factually inaccurate. Misinformation is when you are spreading that factually inaccurate information, but believe it to be true. So, if, for example, you think that, so one common form of misinformation is the belief that vaccines cause autism, for example. And if I genuinely believe that and I shared that on a social media post, that would be misinformation. Disinformation is when I know it's false, but I share it anyway. And so intent becomes a really key distinction between disinformation and misinformation.
It sounds like associating for people who need mnemonics and stuff,
Yeah.
saying like disinformation is deliberate, misinformation isn't. I mean, that
That's
might.
a really great way to phrase it. Yeah, no, I totally agree because the deliberate intent to share false information is the core of disinformation, right? And
Yeah.
oftentimes, a really big question I get is why do people spread disinformation? Like if you know it's false, why would you share it? And it's important to recognize that there are, foreign actors who spread disinformation with the intent of manipulating elections and persuading people to believe in things that are genuinely not true. There are also individuals who lie about their personas online. There's this common phrase, on the internet, you don't know if you're a dog. Uh, and that I think still rings true now. There are a lot of situations where people either try to lie about their identity, or especially with the rise of things like deepfakes, there's a lot of content out now where people intentionally try to make it look authentic when in reality it's artificially generated or fake content. And so this kind of concern about disinformation is more prevalent, I think, than people recognize.
Yeah, and it makes me wonder because like so much in US history,
Mhm.
a lot of things designed to manipulate the public have been targeted at specific groups. So, are you seeing that this disinformation in particular is disproportionately aimed at traditionally underrepresented or disadvantaged people, like communities of color or people from low income households?
Absolutely. And it's, especially frustrating because they tend to disenfranchise voters from these underrepresented populations. So we saw this as early as, 2012 and 2016. And in 2016, probably the most famous example of disinformation in the United States came from Russia or from Russian troll armies. In that particular disinformation campaign, what we saw were that Russian disinformation actors were specifically targeting Black communities. And so they were impersonating Black Americans, pretending to be Black Americans, and producing disinformation specifically targeting those communities. in the lead up to 2020 and now with 2024 on the horizon, we are also seeing a lot more disinformation produced in non English. Because what a lot of disinformation actors have realized is that we do a much like America and social media platforms in the US do a much better job of tracking mis and disinformation in English. But we don't quite have the same resources for Spanish or Mandarin Chinese or many of the other languages that are spoken in the United States. And so we are starting to see more disinformation content that's produced in non English, and we're less prepared to deal with that, unfortunately.
Wow. It's an excellent point. And I mean, I live in Los Angeles, so we have a
Hmm.
high percentage of people who speak
Yeah.
lots of languages other than English. And I know, just as an anecdote or anecdata, if you
Hmm.
will, my husband is Latino, and he said his family has noticed a serious uptick in misinformation and disinformation about COVID and the vaccine, for example. So,
Absolutely. And we're also seeing it a lot in not just text form, but in image and video form. And so my family is really active on WhatsApp, for example. That's a really popular platform, especially for diaspora communities, right? Families in which they've moved from another country to the US. And on WhatsApp, probably the most prevalent form of misinformation that I see comes in the form of either videos or images, memes that family members are sharing with me, uh, oftentimes believing it to be true. And it's much trickier, I think, to track those forms of text and language because they're embedded into videos, they're embedded into images. And so, as a computational researcher, as a programmer, I need to do additional processing to extract that text out so that I can detect the misinformation in
wow, okay. That's because I was actually thinking about that, how we
Yeah,
used to be so much more like we would take in visual information, but we would put
totally.
out like written word. Now we're so
Yeah,
image heavy and video heavy. Yeah, it's definitely a shift.
yeah.
So of course, the multi-million dollar question here, can you tell us how to identify mis and disinformation? Because I know there are so many smart people who listen to this program, people who are scientists, and people who are super well educated in other fields. We
Totally.
think we're smart, we think we're savvy, but stuff is changing. So any pro tips here?
Yeah. Oh gosh, so many thoughts. So in general, like there's no silver bullet way to detect misinformation and disinformation. And part of it is because information changes, right? So the pandemic as a really good example during that time, there was a point where we did not have a vaccine, right? A vaccine had not been developed yet. And so if you shared information about there being a vaccine or a solution for COVID, that would have been misinformation at that time. However, when the vaccine came out, if someone shared a very similar message, of course, that no longer becomes misinformation, right? And so misinformation and disinformation tends to have this kind of timely component to it. It's very context based. And so that for those reasons, it's kind of hard to have like one surefire way to detect it. However, there are a handful of different cues, particularly for telling if something is false content, and then especially for identifying fake accounts. So I'll start with the first thing with fake content. Super importantly, I think it's essential when you see a piece of content that you think might be misinformation that you verify it with another source of information. So, for example, one type of misinformation or disinformation we're seeing is fake screenshots of news stories. So, someone will like make up a news story, slap the CNN logo on it, and then say, like, oh, look at what CNN produced. The easy way to find that as misinformation is to go to CNN's website and see if they've actually covered that story. And so that sort of double checking is really essential for detecting misinformation content specifically. For the disinformation side of things, what I always encourage folks to look for are disinformation accounts. And so these are people who either lie about their identity or are anonymous online and are spreading false content. And you can tell when when some account is a disinformation account in a couple of different ways. Usually, their user profile is a mix of letters and numbers as opposed to a genuine screen name. Oftentimes, they will also have a generic image. Sometimes that image is of like a landscape or something like that. It tends to be a little bit vaguer. But if it is an image of a person, that image tends to be either AI generated or lifted from somewhere else online. And so, one way that you can identify those images as kind of stolen is if you do a reverse image search. And there are many times where we've done reverse image searches and then realized, like, oh, they just pulled this random picture from Twitter or Facebook or a social media platform here.
Wow. It is a little Brave New Worldy, because
Yeah.
we can't believe what our eyes and ears are telling us. I mean, I guess it's just go cross check everything. Is the short answer.
Yeah, and I think cross-checking everything, realizing that we have to have the media literacy, right, to like recognize or be able to recognize on our own when something is misinformation or disinformation. And I know that's a little daunting, but I do think I've seen improvements in that sort of media literacy work, especially over the last couple of years. Even just talking through how do you make sure that a source of the source of a story is a real news organization, is a validated news organization. Those are tips that I have only seen brought into education in the last couple of years.
Yeah, I was wondering, because you're at a university,
Mhm.
are they starting to incorporate uh, basically best practices about media literacy, or teaching like this is how you consume media if you want to get to the truth or to the objectivity? Is that something that you're seeing evolve in academia?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, I'm very fortunate in that I work in a journalism department. And so for many of my students, they are expected to watch the news or to read the news as part of their anticipated occupation. But we are also starting to see media literacy brought into biology classes and brought into, many, many other disciplines, which I think is absolutely critical. We're also seeing a lot more courses and time dedicated to science communication, which is so absolutely critical to combating this misinformation. For example, a lot of misinformation is in the area of health, right? Health communication. And to me, it's really important that scientists step up and correct this sort of misinformation from a data driven empirical way. But sometimes that information gets kind of lost in the technicalities. And so increasingly, I've noticed that STEM fields and STEM departments have started to include science communication as an important part of their education practice. Because if someone's going to be a doctor, if someone's going to be, a biologist or a STEM specialist, they still need to be able to communicate that very important research to the public.
Yeah, and I actually had a journalist who used to work for the Associated Press and is now a professor at George Washington University
Nice.
on a
Yeah.
few episodes ago, and he said a quote that I'm just gonna I might get it tattooed somewhere, but it's lies spread faster than the truth. And
Yeah.
I think that's what you were talking about with WhatsApp. I mean, that stuff is so shareable. It's just toxic.
It's so shareable. It's like so sensationalized, right? I like that quote a lot. I'll need like a sticker on it or something. But lies are really constructed to hit at our heartstrings. They're tend to be really emotionally driven. They tend to be really sensationalized. They tend to have a lot of hyperbole, right? Like you can't believe what happened here, or this is the worst thing to ever happen. And so I think that all of that stuff really lends itself to the shareability, the virality of this content. And it's important to recognize that these sort of lies really take advantage of algorithms on these social media platforms, right? That's why we tend to see that information faster. People share it more quickly with one another, and it's really leveraging the shareability of content online.
Now, this may be a little bit out there, but I was just thinking about past elections and the stories that
Yeah.
dominated the headlines. There was the whole Pizzagate scandal, where
Hmm.
in right wing groups they were saying that prominent Democrats, including Hillary Clinton, were using a pizza restaurant in DC as a front
Yeah.
for a sex trafficking ring. Now, at first, that doesn't seem like, when you just say child sex trafficking in a pizza place, it doesn't sound like you're making a political statement. So
Yeah.
how does that serve like a vested interest or an agenda? How does it get twisted to that?
Totally. So, it does sound kind of like a word salad of words. Um, part of the thing, especially when it came to kind of Pizzagate and its, I guess, subsequent conspiracy theory QAnon, it originally in the internet started as this kind of online trolling campaign, and was originally by the folks who started it did not, I think, believe it seriously. However, one of the how do I phrase this? One of the wild things about this particular conspiracy theory is its ability for other people to glom and add things to it. And so, even if it started as something that was not taken seriously, was kind of unusual and only semi political in nature, what we also saw was that over time, people were adding on other political components to it. Like, oh, this sex trafficking cabal is starting to invade in our elections, or they started talking about this conspiracy in relation to other political issues, including the economy, including COVID 19 and the vaccine, obviously, including our elections, of course. And what we saw was that a lot of people started to actually believe this particular conspiracy theory, which is incredibly tragic. It's so outlandish. And I think when we talk about this particular conspiracy theory, if you hear it for the first time, you're like, how could anyone believe this? But for a lot of folks who do believe it, it was much more of a slow broil, right? There's kind of with the idiom of like, if you put a frog in hot water, they'll jump right out. But if you put a frog in lukewarm water and you increase the temperature, they might not realize it until it's too late. And we see something very similar when it comes to the inoculation into conspiracy theories. So, people who buy into conspiracy theories, it's not like they believe the most extreme things from the get go, but over time, as they engage with that community, as they talk to political conspiracy theorists, they start to buy into these more and more extreme variations.
So that makes me wonder, is this something that you're seeing morph now that we've got even more platform availability? Like TikTok is a force where it didn't used to be, a few election cycles ago. So are we seeing this twisting of something that could happen, like a child sex trafficking ring? They do
Mhm.
exist. And are you seeing like a proliferation of that kind of, here's a tiny bit of truth and then a bunch of lies wrapped around it?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're seeing this proliferation in a couple of different ways. The first is we're seeing it spread onto other smaller platforms. And to use the Pizzagate example, that originally started on 4chan, that got much bigger when it moved to Reddit, and then it started expanding into other social media platforms. After the insurrection on January 6th, a lot of these accounts were deplatformed, suspended, and removed from mainstream platforms. But those communities didn't die. They just moved into these smaller social media platforms like Parler and Getter and Gab that were more amenable to these sort of conspiracy theories. And so we've seen these conspiracy theories flourish in these smaller platforms. The other way in which we are seeing them now, which gives me a lot of pause, is that they're moving from these online spaces to offline spaces. So, where they were originally just communicating on Telegram or on a social media platform, we are now starting to see QAnon related offline events. And it is perhaps no surprise here that when they communicate offline, they build a different form of community and they start to engage in dark participation of political actions. And so there have been several of these QAnon related events, and they will talk about the need for another revolutionary war or the need for a military coup. And again, it's this is where I think we need to really think carefully about what an impact this has on our democracy.
Yeah, I mean, it is deeply disturbing because I think a lot of our society and particularly our democracy were built on the idea that people ultimately wanted stuff that would benefit the greater good, not
Absolutely.
not things that would tear down the other side, because it was seen as it's just different approaches to the same goal. Now it's different goals and screw the other guy, which
Yeah.
it's very toxic. And so you also
It's
mentioned our—
toxic.
oh, go ahead.
Sorry, I was gonna say it's like it's toxic and it's dangerous and it's it it allows this sort of misinformation to spread and be exploited, right? And so you talked briefly about alternative facts, and one of the things that I'm really curious about when I think about political communication and political language is At what point does someone not start believing in the truth, right? At what point is there like a turning point for them? And what I find is with conspiracy theories in particular, if you spend so much time in these conspiratorial spaces, if all you're talking about and all the people you're talking to believe in all this misinformation, it becomes really hard to persuade you that that is misinformation, because at that point that's all the information you're consuming.
That is vaguely terrifying. And so before we turn, I'm going to turn back to like elections
Yeah.
specifically in a minute, but I wanted to say you had mentioned artificial intelligence. So
Yeah.
again, can of worms, how are you
Big can of
starting?
worms.
How are you seeing it start to contribute to the spread of mis and disinformation?
Yeah. So I do think it's worth recognizing that, generative AI or generative artificial intelligence is a tool, right? It can be used for both good and bad things. And we've seen that in a lot of different instances, even though the technology is quite new. And so I wanted to just give a couple of really quick definitions. So artificial intelligence is the use of, computer technology and programming tools uh, to achieve or process different kinds of information. And we've had artificial intelligence in some form or machine learning in some form for a long time, right? So we use artificial intelligence to remove spam, to do autocorrects and things like that. It has existed in other parts of our society. But generative AI, the use of artificial intelligence to generate new forms of communication and content, whether that's text or audio or video content, that's the relatively new development. And I think, OpenAI and their, GPT 3.5, mostly known as ChatGPT, and their other tools have really made generative AI more accessible to the general public. And so I'll start with the bad because I like to end on an optimistic note. Um, in the mis and disinformation space, we're starting to see a lot of Gen AI used specifically to produce mis and disinformation, and then secondarily to help spread misinformation and disinformation. And so for example, we are seeing a lot more uses of Gen AI audio content to fake the voices of politicians. There was actually an ad I saw recently that was using Donald Trump's voice, but it was very clearly AI generated audio content. In India, we are seeing the use of Gen AI to imitate the voices of dead politicians. Yeah.
Whoa.
We're starting to see the use of Gen AI to create fake images of things that never happened. And these were things that were unheard of, 4 years ago, 10 years ago. But they are definitely starting to become more prevalent now. The
Wow.
silver lining, I guess, for this. So I mentioned I'll talk like the bad side of things, and then I think there is a slight silver lining in that Gen AI, as I mentioned, is a tool, right? It can be used for good and bad purposes. And so in the computational social science research, we are also starting to see researchers understand if they can use Gen AI to do this sort of mis and disinformation detection. Because if these tools are really good at creating it, they should also be fairly solid at being able to detect false images. And so I've started to see, especially in computer science and other related fields, the use of Gen AI and specifically like multimodal classifiers that can analyze text and audio and images together to look at these more complex forms of misinformation and disinformation.
Wow. I have concerns about the role of humans going
Yeah.
forward, but it's part of what we have to adapt to. Just living in the time that we do. So going back to elections,
Yeah.
though, I know
Yeah.
that you kind of touched on it a little bit before, but one of the biggest stories from the last few election cycles did focus on Russian interference in U.S. elections, and that
Mhm.
was via organized, engineered online campaigns.
Yeah.
So I know you've worked on that and studied it. So what are some of the key takeaways? Obviously, knowing that they were targeting Black people with a lot of
Mhm.
their work, but what else can you tell us?
Yeah, one of the other things that is really important to recognize when it comes to Russian disinformation specifically is that they do a fair bit of surveillance before they actually conduct their disinformation campaign. And so prior to the Internet Research Agency, which was the troll army in 2016, Russia's troll army, they actually visited the United States understood the political issues that we were grappling with. And then when they were building these disinformation campaigns, they would exploit existing tensions within the country in order to make sure their content was more viral, in order to increase distrust in the media ecology, and in order to leverage the media ecology's kind of attention getting metrics. So, for example, one thing that Russia has historically done and continues to do into 2020 and into 2025, 2024, is to exploit news media specifically. That includes the creation of a bunch of fake news organizations. So, Russia had these like fake accounts that included terms like today in Miami or today in Philadelphia. And they created hundreds of these fake news organizations that would then share a weird mix of sometimes true and sometimes false stories. What we also saw were that Russian trolls were very often at mentioning, especially on Twitter, they were at mentioning reporters and they were at mentioning the social media accounts of these news organizations so that their social media post would be hopefully like picked up by a news organization. And we did in 2016, 2017 find that many US based news organizations were accidentally quoting Russian trolls. And when they did that, Russian trolls benefited because they got more followers as a result of being quoted in a news story. And these were things that, journalists over time have increasingly started to use social media as a way to source information, as a way to get quotes from the public. And while I think that is inevitable and can be really helpful for journalism, it also created this loophole that Russian trolls could exploit and absolutely did.
So a lot of that is
Yeah.
pretty bleak. And like you, I like to kind of be positive as well. So
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you, at this point in your career, how have you seen the data you've collected and analyzed help in the fight for like freer, fairer elections and democracy, either here in the U.S. or abroad?
Yeah, that's such a great question. So, when I was doing my work originally on Russian trolls and looking at its kind of the spread of that social media content into news media, I had an opportunity to talk to a lot of journalists in newsrooms about better practices for validating a quote that they wanted to, like a tweet that they wanted to quote in a news story. And I spoke with them a lot about how to retain that information as well, because when these Russian trolls were suspended, their content also got removed from the news story. And a lot of journalists also noticed this when it came to Donald Trump. So when he was suspended from Twitter, all of the embedded tweets broke across these social media or across these news stories. And so I was working a lot with journalists about how to make sure those things have long-standing survivability. And I've seen a lot of improvements in the way that journalists have reported on social media stories and especially reported on stories where they're quoting social media users. The other area that I think has become that gives me a lot of optimism is specifically when it comes to uh, election information, especially when it comes to voting. So in 2016 and in 2020, I think it was much harder to have one or two like really concrete places where you can find out like where your polling location is or how to submit a mail-in ballot. And I think a lot of folks have realized that this is critical information for any citizen to have during an election. And so I've seen this increase in not just media literacy, but political voting literacy, right? And I think there are a lot more resources now for how to find your polling location, how to put in a mail in ballot compared to 5 or 10 years ago.
That makes sense too. The thing that always strikes me is that it
Hmm.
seems like there's somebody using these tools, using whether it's generative AI or just basically whisper campaigns,
Yeah.
sharing this stuff. They're trying to get people not to vote,
Yeah.
which it kind of touches at the idea of your vote is your voice, and if they can
Absolutely.
silence you, then they don't need to accommodate you when they're making policy. So
Yeah. And
this
I
is
do think,
critical.
as you mentioned, this is like not only is it critical, but it does tend to target underrepresented populations, communities of color, low income communities, communities that have very few polling locations, right? If you have to wait in line longer to place your ballot, it's going to be much like your willingness to vote becomes a lot harder, right? And as a country, we should be doing more to encourage voting, not making it harder.
Here, here. Let's get
Yeah.
on that. Seriously though, that is so critical. And so you said you would join UCS's election science task force. So
Yeah.
tell me how you think this task force. Tell me how you think this task force can help us move the needle in the run up and after the 2024 elections.
Yeah. When I first met the group of folks who were going to be a part of this task force, one of the things I was in awe of was the sheer number of disciplines that were included in this, as well as the number of civil society organizations, election commissions, and people who are actually on the ground doing ballot work and election work. And I think that's a pretty, not only is it a remarkable group of folks, but it's such a diverse group of individuals in terms of their expertise. But they all shared this unifying interest and goal of improving our elections, making sure citizens had the information that they need to be able to vote responsibly. And so I think that was one of the most exciting things that I saw when I was, meeting with this group for the first time. I think this is also a group of researchers and scientists that are really data driven and empirically driven. And I think in elections, we don't always get that, right? A lot of times the goal is more so to persuade individuals with political language as opposed to thinking through with data, how can we best help citizens? And so I think in this kind of task force, they've been thinking very carefully about what kind of data do we need in order to help democracy and to help our elections. And they've been thinking about it very carefully, both in terms of what is the information that is important prior to an election, right? That includes information about how to cast your ballot, what candidates are saying, like explicitly. It includes also, though, uh, research on what happens after the election. And I think that a lot of times in the past, we kind of tend to disregard it, right? Like an election happens and then it's over, and then we like move on to the next thing in our very busy lives. But if 2020 has shown us anything, it is that that period after the election is so critical because not everyone's going to necessarily believe that the election results were true. And so the task force has also expressed a lot of interest in making sure the work we're doing before the election continues during and after the election. And I think that's so essential to our democracy.
We need that continuity. And as we saw in 2020, without a general acceptance on what reality is, you can
Yeah.
have some pretty deadly results.
Yeah.
So there is a last question that I have for you, and it's a two-parter. So
Love
we
it.
we are the Union of Concerned Scientists. So
Yeah.
Dr. Joe Lukito, why are you concerned?
I am concerned because I have been an American citizen. I was born and raised in the United States, and I've cared a lot about the democratic institutions in the United States. And I am really concerned that they are under threat, not only by external actors such as Russia, but also by our own citizens. And I want to make sure that this is a democracy that stays a democracy long after I'm alive, long after my kids are alive. And so I think whatever we can do as citizens and whatever we can do as scientists to make sure that our democratic institutions remain is just so critical.
Okay, so now the second part. What are you specifically going to do about that concern?
Yeah. So one of the ongoing projects that I'm working on is the collection of social media content for any federal candidate that is running for office. The project is called the Candidates and Social Handles Election Database, Cached 24. And this is the first effort with a couple of different research centers, as well as several civil society organizations, to collectively come together and try to compile all the social media handles from any any candidate running for federal office in the United States for 2024. We think that this content is really important to citizens. We think citizens have a right to this information, and we think that citizens should know what their politicians or what their candidates are saying, whether it's about the economy, whether it's about healthcare, and whether it's about election fraud. And so we want to make this database and this resource available to citizens, available to journalists and researchers. And we're working really hard to make sure that if this works for 2024, doing it in future elections.
That is some fascinating work, and I really appreciate the see, I can't talk today. That
It's just the excitement.
I know, and this was such a good conversation. No, I appreciate what you're doing, and I'm so excited that you're part of the task force, and I'm really excited to follow your career and your research output because this is so essential to our existence in the 21st century.
Thank you so much. And I think science is important in so many places in our lives, right? And it touches upon us in so many ways. And I think for as long as we have politics, we're going to need scientists to make sure the work is data driven.
Here again. Hell yeah.